thought my mother-in-law was being kind when she offered to drive me to the doctor that Tuesday morning. I had no idea she was about to confess that she and my husband had spent the last 8 months building a legal trap designed to drain every dollar I had ever earned. The car hadn't even left the driveway when she turned to me with that practiced, sorrowful smile, the one I'd mistaken for warmth for 6 years, and said words that would unravel everything I believed about my marriage, my money, and the woman sitting 3 feet away from me with her hands folded neatly in her lap like she was about to read from a hymn book. What she told me on that drive wasn't a confession. It was a warning. And the difference between those two things would take me weeks to fully understand. My name is Clara. I'm 34 years old, and until 18 months ago, I was the kind of person who considered herself lucky. Not in a passive, counting blessings way. I mean, I had built something real. I had a career I was proud of, a salary that reflected years of sacrifice and 70-hour weeks, a small house in a neighborhood where I knew the names of the neighbors' dogs, and a husband named Jason who laughed at my jokes and made strong coffee and always remembered to lock the back door at night. We weren't perfect, no one is, but we were ours, solid and familiar and warm in the way that a well-worn quilt is warm, not because it's glamorous, but because it fits exactly right. I work in pharmaceutical sales management. I had spent 11 years climbing a ladder that most people in my field told me was impossible for someone without a graduate degree, and by the time I was 32, I was earning a base salary of $118,000 a year, with a bonus structure that, in a good quarter, pushed that comfortably past 6 figures in additions alone. I'm not saying this to boast. I'm saying it because that number, that salary, that income, the direct deposit that hit my account on the 1st and 15th of every month like clockwork, became the center of gravity around which everything else would eventually collapse. Jason worked in construction management. He made good money, too, though not quite what I made, and for a while we operated the way a lot of couples do. Separate accounts, shared expenses split down the middle, savings accounts we each managed independently. It worked. We didn't argue about money, not really, because we had both agreed early on that financial independence within a marriage wasn't a sign of distrust. It was a sign of respect. That was the word Jason used when we first set it up, sitting at the kitchen table with a bottle of wine and a spreadsheet. Respect. He said it with such conviction that I didn't question it. I just nodded and thought, yes, this is exactly the kind of man I want to build a life with. His mother, Brenda, had always been a fixture at the edges of our life. Not intrusive exactly, or at least not in any way I could name cleanly at the time. She lived 40 minutes away in the house Jason had grown up in, a sprawling beige colonial with a rose garden out front that she tended with the same meticulous, slightly territorial energy she applied to everything else in her life. She called Jason every Sunday without fail. She sent birthday cards with handwritten notes that were always a little too long, a little too detailed about what she had sacrificed, a little too careful to remind you of all the ways she had been present and generous. She was the kind of woman who kept receipts, not just financial ones, but emotional ones, cataloged and cross-referenced and ready to be produced at the precise moment they would cause the most damage. I told myself I liked her. More accurately, I told myself that my discomfort around her was my problem, not hers. She made Jason's favorite pot roast every time we visited and asked after my work with what seemed like genuine interest, tilting her head at just the right angle when I answered, narrowing her eyes slightly as if she were really listening, really filing it away. I thought she was engaged. I understand now that she was researching. The first time anything felt genuinely wrong was 8 months before the car ride. We were at Sunday dinner at Brenda's house, the kind of dinner that felt mandatory rather than invited, the kind where you dress slightly better than necessary because somehow the house itself seems to demand it. And she asked me, midway through the salad course, whether my company had recently changed its bonus structure. I remember the exact quality of the light in that dining room, the way it came through the lace curtains and landed in pale, uneven squares on the tablecloth. I remember the sound of silverware against the good china. I remember thinking, that's an oddly specific question. I told her it hadn't changed significantly. She nodded, cut a piece of cucumber, and said, I only ask because Jason mentioned you'd had a particularly strong quarter. That must feel so rewarding, she smiled. Jason reached for his water glass. Neither of them looked at me. Later that night, driving home, I brought it up. Why was your mom asking about my bonus? Jason kept his eyes on the road. She was just making conversation, he said. She's proud of you. We both are. I remember wanting to believe that. I remember choosing to believe it, the way you choose to believe the weather forecast on a day you've planned a picnic, not because the evidence supports your hope, but because the alternative is too inconvenient to accommodate. Over the next several months, there were other small moments. Brenda asking whether I'd considered upgrading our home insurance policy. Given your income level, you're really underinsured. Brenda mentioning, casually, that she had a friend who worked in financial planning who might be able to help us think about the future. Brenda asking at Thanksgiving whether Jason and I had ever considered a joint account. It would make things so much simpler, wouldn't it, sweetheart? That last word directed at Jason, not at me, which was the part I should have noticed. Each of these moments, taken individually, was dismissible. Together, in retrospect, they form a map so obvious, I want to take the version of myself that lived through them by the shoulders and shake. Jason, in this same period, grew quieter. Not dramatically, not in the kind of way you'd describe to a friend and have them say, "That's a red flag." It was more like a slow dimming, the way the light changes in October, so gradual that you keep being surprised by the darkness because you never quite catch the moment it shifted. He stopped asking about my work. He started taking calls from his mother in the other room, which he'd never done before. He began bringing up, at random intervals, the idea of restructuring our finances. Not because I don't trust you, obviously. It's just about efficiency. And each time I deflected gently, he'd nod and let it go. And I'd feel a small, unnamed unease settle somewhere in my chest that I kept mistaking for stress about work. I was stressed about work. That was also true. My company was going through a merger in the first quarter of that year, and my position, while secure, according to HR, was in a period of formal review. My direct deposit had been temporarily routed through a transitional payroll system, which meant my statements looked different for about 6 weeks. The account numbers changed, and for a brief, complicated period, I was receiving pay through a new intermediary account that I hadn't fully communicated to Jason because, frankly, it was my account, and I didn't think I needed to. This detail, small and administrative as it felt to me at the time, was something Brenda had somehow learned about, and she had built an entire architecture around it. The Tuesday morning that changed everything started like all the worst mornings do, quietly, normally, with the smell of coffee and the unremarkable gray light of an April day. I had woken up with a tension headache that had been building for 3 days, the kind that sits behind your eyes and turns the light slightly wrong, and Jason had already left for an early site meeting by the time I came downstairs. I was standing at the kitchen sink in my robe, pressing 2 ibuprofen out of the foil with one hand and holding my phone with the other, when Brenda knocked on the front door. She wasn't supposed to be there. We hadn't planned anything. I remember the particular jolt of confusion that comes with an unexpected presence at your own door, the way your brain struggles to recontextualize the morning around an intrusion you weren't prepared for. I opened the door, and she was standing there in a pale blue cardigan, her purse over one arm, looking somehow both sympathetic and decided, the expression of someone who has already concluded a negotiation they haven't yet begun. "Jason called me," she said. "He said you weren't feeling well. I thought I'd come take you to the clinic, save you the drive." She said it so naturally, so matter-of-factly, that I didn't immediately register the strangeness. I hadn't spoken to Jason that morning. I hadn't told him I wasn't feeling well. I had a headache, yes, but I hadn't mentioned it to anyone. A cold finger ran up the inside of my spine, but I pushed it aside. Maybe he'd noticed I wasn't sleeping. Maybe he'd texted her on his way out and I'd missed it. Maybe. "I'm fine," I said. "Just a headache." "I know," she said. And then, and this is the part I've replayed more times than I can count, she said, "Tell everyone you feel sick. I'll take you to the clinic. I'll explain on the way." The words themselves weren't threatening. The tone was almost gentle. But there was something underneath them, something compressed and deliberate, like a sentence that had been rehearsed so many times it had worn smooth. Tell everyone you feel sick. Not feel sick. Tell everyone. I stood in my doorway in my bathrobe with the taste of ibuprofen dissolving on the back of my tongue and felt the world shift very slightly on its axis. I went and got dressed. I don't know why. Something in her voice made refusing feel impossible. Not because she was aggressive, but because she was certain. And certainty in someone who has already decided something can be more coercive than any threat. I put on jeans and a gray sweater. I told myself it was probably nothing. I got in her car. She didn't take me toward the clinic. She drove in the opposite direction, toward the highway. And for the first several minutes, she said nothing at all. Just drove with her hands at 10 and 2 and her eyes on the road. The silence was thick and pressurized, the kind that knows it's about to break. I watched the neighborhood scroll past the window, the park, the coffee shop, the dry cleaner with the striped awning, and felt something between dread and surreal calm, the feeling of a person who has not yet been told they're in danger, but whose body has already begun to prepare. "There are some things," Brenda began, "that I think you should know before this goes any further." She didn't look at me. Her hands were completely steady on the wheel. "What things?" My voice came out smaller than I intended. She exhaled through her nose. Not quite a sigh, more like a measured release, like someone who has been holding a position for a long time and is finally, carefully letting it shift. "I have been trying," she said, "for the better part of a year to protect my son. I want you to understand that. I have not been acting against you, Clara. I have been acting for him. There is a difference." I waited. "He came to me last March," she continued, very upset. "He told me that he had discovered some financial irregularities in your household accounts, money that was being moved without his knowledge, transfers he couldn't account for." She paused, and in the pause, I could feel her watching my reaction from her peripheral vision, even while she kept her eyes on the road. "He was worried. He didn't know what to do. I suggested we consult someone." My hands, folded in my lap, had gone cold. "What do you mean, irregularities?" I said. There aren't any irregularities. My accounts are mine. They've always been separate. Jason knows that." "He knows you have separate accounts," she said, with a delicacy that was almost surgical. "He didn't know about the transitional account." She let that land. The one that received approximately $32,000 in the spring from a source that wasn't immediately traceable to your employer. The number hit me like ice water. That was my payroll restructure. That was the transitional payroll account. That was $32,000 in salary, deposited during a 6-week window when my company was migrating payment systems. There was nothing irregular about it. I had documentation. I had a letter from HR. I had pay stubs. I had, and this is when the cold in my hands began spreading upward toward my chest, I had all of that documentation at home, in my files, in the house I shared with Jason, in the filing cabinet in the home office that we both had access to. "Brenda," I said, and I was working hard to keep my voice level, "that was my salary, from my job, during a payroll transition. I have documentation. Jason could have asked me about it at any time." "He felt," she said carefully, "that you weren't being transparent. He could have asked me. He was afraid of your reaction." I looked at her then, really looked at her, turned my whole head and studied the profile of this woman I had shared holidays and Sunday dinners with for 6 years. There was nothing on her face that looked like conflict, nothing that looked like regret or discomfort, or the specific quality that appears on a person's face when they know they are about to wound someone who did not deserve it. She looked calm. She looked resolved. She looked, I thought, with a sudden crystalline clarity, like a woman who had been planning this drive for a long time. "What did you do?" I asked. My voice had gone very quiet. She took the highway ramp, merged smoothly, checked her mirrors. We consulted a financial attorney, she said. We filed a formal notice of financial misconduct with the court on the grounds of undisclosed income and potential asset concealment. You would have received the paperwork by the end of the week. She paused. I wanted to tell you in person first. I thought you deserved that. The world went very still. Inside my skull, something that had been a tension headache rearranged itself into something else entirely, a roaring, white silence that was somehow both loud and absolutely empty. I was looking at the gray ribbon of highway unspooling ahead of us, at the pale April sky, at the green exit signs ticking past, and I was trying to fit the shape of what she had just said into a reality that made sense. And it would not fit. It would not fit. The edges were all wrong. Financial misconduct, a court filing, undisclosed income, asset concealment, my salary, my payroll transfer, my $32,000 that had landed in my transitional account during a merger and that I had not thought to announce to my husband because it was my money, always had been, was never our money, and they had taken that silence and built a legal case inside it. You filed against me, I said. Jason filed, she said, with my guidance. He filed against me. She didn't answer that directly. Instead, she said, there's a meeting scheduled for Thursday with both attorneys. I'm telling you now so you have time to prepare. I thought it was the kind thing to do. I want to describe what I felt in that moment, but the honest answer is that I felt several contradictory things simultaneously, layered on top of each other like geological strata. There was the cold shock of betrayal, yes, but underneath that, a confusion so profound it was almost dizzying, because the story she was telling didn't match any version of my life I recognized. And underneath even that, beginning to push upward through the layers, like something that had been waiting underground for a long time, was something I could only describe as the slow, terrible beginning of rage. Not the hot, disorganized rage of a person who has been startled. The other kind. The kind that is very cold and very quiet, and that knows, even before you've fully assembled the evidence, exactly how serious things are. I turned back to the window. I watched a truck merge into the lane beside us. I made myself breathe, slowly and deliberately, through my nose and out through my mouth, the way you breathe when you are trying to keep something large and dangerous very, very still inside yourself. Take me home, I said. She didn't take me home right away. That was the first thing I understood, that even my instructions, spoken clearly in her car, on her terms, were subject to her judgment. She drove for another 4 minutes before taking the next exit, and in those 4 minutes, I sat with my hands in my lap and my face turned toward the window and said nothing, because I understood with sudden, perfect clarity that anything I offered could become a brick in a wall designed to contain me. She pulled into the parking lot of a gas station, put the car in park, turned to look at me directly for the first time since we'd left my driveway. I'm not your enemy, Clara, she said. I looked at her. I took in the blue cardigan, the pearl stud earrings, the silver hair cut neatly at the jaw, the hands folded in her lap like a woman about to deliver a sermon. I looked at the face of someone I had handed birthday cards to, had hugged at Christmas under the mistletoe she always hung in the same spot every year, had complimented on her pot roast with genuine warmth. I looked at her and felt something inside me perform a slow, final rearrangement. You filed a legal complaint against me based on my salary, I said. You and my husband, together, behind my back. She held my gaze. We filed a request for financial disclosure. It's a standard family law. It accuses me of asset concealment, I said. Those were your exact words. Something moved behind her eyes. Not remorse, but recalculation. The brief adjustment of a person who had planned extensively for many responses, but had not fully anticipated this one. The language was the attorney's, she said. I'm not a lawyer. No, I said, you're not. I opened the car door. I'll call a cab. I stood in the parking lot of that gas station in the pale April air and called my father. My father, David, is a retired civil engineer, the kind of man who responds to crises by becoming denser, quieter, more fundamentally himself. When I told him what had happened, standing by the air pump while Brenda's car idled and watched from across the lot, he didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, "Are you safe?" I said yes. He said, "Don't say another word to her. I'm coming. Don't go back to the house alone." He arrived in 22 minutes. He handed me a takeaway coffee cup from the drive-thru he'd stopped at on the way, because my father has always believed that hot coffee is a form of structural support, and he is not wrong. Brenda was still parked when we left. I watched her in the side mirror until the car turned and she disappeared. I had a lawyer by 2 o'clock. Her name was Margaret, perhaps 55, dark reading glasses on a chain, a habit of writing things down in unhurried cursive while you talked that somehow communicated both complete attention and total composure. She listened to everything. She asked 3 clarifying questions. Then she looked at me over her glasses and said, "This is a pressure tactic. Someone wanted you reactive and at a disadvantage. Let's talk about what we're going to do about it." The filing, she explained, was real but thin. Financial disclosure proceedings required evidence of deliberate concealment, not merely the existence of a separate account. My transitional payroll account, if I had documentation from my employer, was not concealment. It was a payroll migration. The HR letter, the pay stubs, the company memo, all exculpatory. "They wanted you scared," Margaret said. "Let's give them something to be scared of instead." I called my HR department that afternoon and requested a certified package of every document related to the payroll transition. Patricia, the administrator who had processed my paperwork personally, was baffled and apologetic. "Of course," she said, "couriered to your attorney by tomorrow morning." A pause. "Is everything all right?" I told her it would be. I almost believed it. Jason called at 4:30. I watched his name on my screen and let it ring. At 5:17, he sent a text. "Clara, please talk to me. I know this isn't how I wanted this to go. Not I'm sorry, not I didn't mean for this to happen, but this isn't how I wanted this to go." A sentence that acknowledged a plan while objecting only to its execution. I showed it to my father. He read it and said nothing. He stirred the soup. I slept at my father's house in my childhood bedroom, in the narrow bed under the window where I had slept through every teenage heartbreak and every ordinary night of a life I'd once taken for granted. The room smelled of old wood and faint lavender. I lay in the dark and let myself feel absolutely everything without trying to manage it. The grief of realizing that the person whose shoes were by your door, whose breathing you had listened to on 1,000 ordinary nights, had been sitting across from you at dinner tables for months as someone you didn't know at all. I cried until I was empty. Then I slept. In the morning I felt different, not healed, nothing as clean or false as that, but the grief had burned itself down to something harder underneath, something that felt less like pain and more like purpose. Margaret called at 8:45. "There's something you need to know," she said. The filing, it turned out, was not only thin, it was fraudulent. In the supporting documentation Jason had submitted, there was a signed statement, signed ostensibly by me, confirming that I had been made aware of the financial review and had agreed to participate voluntarily. My name, my signature, on a document I had never seen, never touched, never signed. I sat at my father's kitchen table and felt the rage arrive, not as an explosion, but as a door opening onto a long hallway suddenly illuminated, every door along it becoming visible at once. He had forged my signature, or Brenda had, or they had done it together, sitting at her dining room table under the lace curtain light, with the good china in the cabinet and the rose garden outside, and some careful hand moving across a page. Forged my signature on a legal document, filed it with a court, and then Brenda had come to my door in her blue cardigan and offered me a ride to the clinic. "We are no longer in the territory of a pressure tactic," Margaret said, in the same steady voice she used for everything. "We are in the territory of legal misconduct. If we pursue this, and I think we should, it means a formal complaint to the court and personal legal liability for whoever signed your name." A pause. "I want you to decide how far you want to take this." "All the way," I said. The confrontation with Jason happened that evening. I asked my father to let me go alone, not out of lingering hope, but because I needed to look at him without a witness. He was at the kitchen counter with a glass of water when I came through the door, and he looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. Not quite guilt, but the exhausted vacancy of a person who has been dreading a specific moment so long that its arrival brings something almost like relief. "I need the truth," I said. I set my bag down. I did not raise my voice. "All of it." He sat. He looked at his hands. His mother had approached him in February, not March as she'd claimed, with what she described as concerns. She had told him that in a marriage where one partner earned significantly more, the higher earner historically used that disparity as control. She had told him I was building a financial exit strategy, that the separate account was part of it. She had told him this over Sunday dinners and Tuesday coffees and phone calls for weeks and months, in the patient, repetitive way that water works on stone. "She said you were going to leave me," he said, still looking at his hands. "Did you believe that?" A long pause. "She was so certain. And you were working so much. You were distant." "Jason," I waited until he looked at me. "Did you sign my name on a legal document?" The silence was absolute. He opened his mouth, closed it. "She said it was just a formality," he said, barely audible. "Yes or no?" Another pause. "Yes." I stood up. I picked up my bag. I stood in the kitchen with its familiar smell of wood floors and the faint memory of every ordinary morning we had ever shared, and I looked at him one last time. He looked diminished, smaller than I had ever seen him, like something had gone out. "Call your attorney tonight," I said quietly. "Tell him you're withdrawing the filing. Tonight, not tomorrow, because if I go back to Margaret with this, we won't be discussing withdrawal. We'll be discussing forgery charges." He nodded. He didn't argue. He didn't say his mother's name. I walked out. The next 6 weeks were not quiet, but they were purposeful. Margaret filed a formal complaint documenting the fraudulent signature and requesting full dismissal. Jason's attorney did not mount a defense. The filing was withdrawn within 48 hours. Brenda hired her own attorney, which told me everything about how she had intended this to end. But faced with handwriting analysis confirming the forged signature, there was very little to do except negotiate her exposure. She was required to pay Margaret's full legal fees. She received a formal court reprimand. Her attorney faced a separate bar inquiry. None of this made headlines. These things rarely do. The machinery of justice in family law runs slowly and without drama, in fluorescent-lit conference rooms with bad coffee and careful language. But it ran. And in running, it formally, officially, permanently contradicted every version of events Brenda had ever offered. Jason and I divorced 8 months later. He moved into an apartment across town. I sold my share of the house at market value because I wanted clean edges, and found a second-floor apartment with tall windows and a balcony that faced east. I filled it slowly with things I had chosen alone for reasons entirely my own. My father came for dinner the first Saturday after I moved in. We drank wine on the balcony in the early autumn dark and talked about ordinary things: his garden, my work, a novel he was reading. At some point, the conversation went quiet in the comfortable way that only happens with people you've known your whole life. And I sat with my glass in my hand and felt the particular stillness of a woman who has come through something and is still here, still intact, still entirely her own. "Are you all right?" he asked. The way he always asks, not dramatically, just a direct and genuine question from a man who actually wants to know. I thought about it honestly. "Yes," I said. "I think I actually am." Below us, the city moved and glittered. Somewhere across town, Brenda was in her house with the rose garden, and Jason was in his apartment. And Margaret was in her office with her glasses on their chain. And life had rearranged itself into new configurations I was still slowly learning to trust. The worst thing about betrayal, I've come to understand, is not the damage. It's the revision, the retroactive rewriting of every shared memory, every ordinary Tuesday, every locked back door at night. The way it reaches backward and recolors everything you thought you knew. That's the thing you grieve longest. But the past is finished. It is documented and done. And the morning is mine.